The year is 1942. The month is June. We are on the Eastern Front, in the Crimea, outside the besieged Soviet city of Sevastopol. The ground begins to shake. It starts as a low rumble, deep in the earth, like an approaching earthquake. But there are no fault lines here. The vibration grows louder. It rattles the teeth of the soldiers in the trenches miles away. It knocks teacups off tables in command bunkers. Then, a deafening roar tears the sky apart. It is a sound so loud that it bursts the eardrums of anyone standing too close without protection. A split second later, a dark shape screams into the stratosphere. It is not a plane. It is a projectile. It weighs 7 tons, the same as a fully loaded school bus. It is the size of a small tank. It arcs over the mountains, climbing higher than Mount Everest, before plunging down towards the harbor city. When it hits, it doesn't just explode. It erases. It punches through 100 feet of solid rock and reinforced concrete before detonating deep underground. The shockwave tosses a ship in the harbor out of the water like a toy in a bathtub. The Soviets are stunned. They have no idea what just hit them. They think it must be a new type of massive aerial bomb, or perhaps sabotage. But it wasn't a bomb. It was a shell, fired from a gun. Sitting 20 miles away, hidden in a valley, is the largest weapon ever built in the history of human warfare. It is 150 feet long. It stands 4 stories tall. It is painted a dark, menacing field gray, and it is so heavy that it cannot run on a normal railroad track. It requires 2 parallel tracks running side by side just to keep from sinking into the earth. This is the Schwerer Gustav. Heavy Gustav. It is a 1,350-ton monster, a machine of absolute excess, a weapon built by a regime obsessed with size, power, and terror. This is the story of the Nazi train that fired shells the size of cars, the story of an engineering marvel that was also a strategic disaster. To understand why this dinosaur of steel was created, we have to travel back to the 1930s. Adolf Hitler and the German High Command were staring at a map of France. They were obsessed with the Maginot Line, the massive chain of French fortifications that protected the border. They believed that no standard tank or artillery could break through those concrete bunkers. They needed a can opener, a superweapon. Hitler visited the Krupp family works in Essen. Krupp was the legendary armorer of Germany, the company that had built the guns for World War I. Hitler asked Alfred Krupp if he could build a gun capable of punching through 7 meters of reinforced concrete or a full meter of steel armor plate. Krupp said yes, but the physics were terrifying. To penetrate that much concrete, the shell had to be massive. The engineers calculated that the caliber needed to be 80 centimeters. That is 31 inches wide. You could crawl inside the barrel of this gun. To fire a shell that big, the gun itself had to be gigantic. When the design was finished, the statistics were mind-bending. The barrel alone was 106 feet long. The breech block, the part that closes the back of the gun, weighed as much as a Tiger tank. The recoil force generated by firing was so violent that a traditional gun carriage would have disintegrated instantly. So the engineers did something that had never been done before. They distributed the weight over a massive chassis with 40 axles and 80 wheels. But even with 80 wheels, a single railroad track would have snapped under the weight. So the Gustav was designed to ride on double tracks, 2 railway lines built perfectly parallel to each other. It was essentially a rolling factory. But building it was the easy part. The real nightmare was moving it. The Schwerer Gustav was not a weapon you could just hook up to a locomotive and drive to the front. It was too wide for tunnels. It was too heavy for bridges. To move it, the gun had to be disassembled into thousands of separate pieces. These pieces were loaded onto 25 separate heavy freight trains. Imagine the logistics. You aren't just moving a gun, you are moving an entire army corps to support it. When the train arrived, near the firing position in Crimea, the work was just beginning. A dedicated workforce of 4,000 men was required just to lay the special double-track railway. They worked for 5 weeks, digging embankments and reinforcing the ground. And they had to build something else, a curve. The Gustav had a fatal flaw. The gun barrel could move up and down to change the range, but it could not move left or right. It was fixed to the chassis. To aim the gun left or right, you had to move the entire 1,300-ton train along a curved piece of track. If the target was to the left, you pushed the train forward along the curve. If it was to the right, you pulled it back. Aiming this weapon was like trying to park an ocean liner in a garage. Finally, in June 1942, the order to fire was given. The target was Sevastopol, the strongest fortress city in the world. The crew loaded the gun. The process took 20 minutes to half an hour. A massive crane lifted the 7-ton shell. A hydraulic ram pushed it into the breach. Then, bags of propellant, gunpowder, were loaded behind it. The propellant charge alone weighed nearly 3,000 pounds. The master gunner stood at a safe distance. The concussion from the blast was lethal. Fire! The earth shook. The 40-foot flame erupted from the muzzle. The first targets were the coastal batteries. Gustav obliterated them. Then it turned its attention to something known as Fort Stalin. Direct hit. The concrete fortress crumbled like sand. But the most famous shot was against a target called White Cliff. Soviet intelligence had built a massive ammunition depot under the waters of Severnaya Bay. It was buried under 30 meters of seawater and another 30 meters of solid concrete. They believed it was nuclear-proof before nukes even existed. The Gustav fired a special, concrete-piercing shell. The projectile didn't explode on impact. It dove into the water. It punched through the seafloor. It drilled through 100 feet of rock and concrete. And then, deep in the darkness of the bunker, the delayed fuse triggered. The explosion was apocalyptic. The shockwave caused a tsunami in the harbor. The entire ammunition supply for the Soviet army in Sevastopol was vaporized in a single second. For a brief moment, the Schwerer Gustav was the king of the battlefield. It fired 48 shots at Sevastopol. It wore out its barrel. It terrified the enemy. It seemed like the ultimate triumph of German engineering, but in reality, the gun was already obsolete. The problem was simple. It was a dinosaur in the age of mammals. As the war turned against Germany, the skies filled with Allied bombers and Soviet attack planes. A weapon as big as the Gustav was a pilot's dream target. It couldn't run. It couldn't hide. It took days to dismantle. It was stuck on its special tracks. If a single plane spotted it, the game was over. The Germans spent more resources protecting the gun than the gun actually destroyed. They had to surround it with 2 battalions of anti-aircraft flak cannons. They had to create massive smoke screens to hide it from the air. It became a burden, a heavy, slow, expensive burden. After the siege of Sevastopol, the gun was moved to Leningrad, but it never fired again. The Soviet army was advancing too fast. The Germans spent months setting it up, only to tear it down again and run away. It spent the rest of the war hiding in tunnels, terrified of the Royal Air Force. In the final days of 1945, as the US Army closed in from the west and the Red Army from the east, the German engineers made a final decision. They would not let their masterpiece be captured intact. In a forest near Chemnitz, they attached demolition charges to the massive barrel and the breech block. They blew the metal beast apart. When the American soldiers found the wreckage, they were stunned. They climbed over the massive twisted wheels. They posed for photos, standing inside the barrel. A barrel large enough for a grown man to walk through without ducking. They looked at it with a mixture of awe and confusion. It was a technological marvel, yes, but it was a strategic failure. The Schwerer Gustav represents the absolute peak and the absolute end of the era of big guns. It proved that there is a limit to engineering. It proved that you can build a weapon that is too powerful, a weapon that requires a city to build, an army to operate, and a country to move, while the future of warfare belonged to agile tanks, stealthy submarines, and long-range missiles. The Gustav belonged to the past. It was the last thundering roar of the Iron Giants. Today, nothing remains of the gun itself. Only a few inert shells and pieces of the track exist in museums. But the legend of the 1,350-ton train lives on. It is a reminder that in war and in engineering, bigger isn't always better. Sometimes the most dangerous machine is the one you can't see. Thanks for watching Iron Legacy. If you enjoyed this story of the biggest gun ever made, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments. If you had to choose a weapon to defend a city, would you take one Schwerer Gustav or 50 tanks? See you in the next one.